Welcome to Elixir Wizards, a podcast brought to you by SmartLogic, a custom web and mobile development shop.
This is Season 15, The State of the Stack. Join us for conversations about how the software development landscape is evolving.
Each episode examines observable shifts, what's driving those changes, and how people in the community are adapting in response. Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Suggs, staff engineer at SmartLogic.
And I'm Emma Whamond, a software developer at SmartLogic. And we're your hosts for Season 15, Episode 9. We're joined by Mallory Knodel, Executive Director and founder of the Social Web Foundation. Mallory is a special interest technologist working at the intersection of internet governance, human rights, open standards, and decentralized social platforms. Today, we're discussing the state of the open internet and why developers should care about governance, human rights, and who controls the digital spaces we all rely on. Hey.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Glad you could join us. Welcome to the podcast. So before we jump into the topic, perhaps you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your history, and what you've been up to recently.
Sure. So yeah, as you said, I'm a public interest technologist. I have spent my whole career thinking about ways that we can leverage technology and science more broadly for social movements in particular. So I've been an activist also my whole life prior to my even having a career. And so it's been a real, I think it's been a really interesting journey to see how technology has served social movements over the years. I think I started my career really understanding that if I could just help social movement organizations build great websites and teach them how to use social media, that I would be really serving the greater good. And of course, that's still true, right? We need technology and the internet for communications. But, you know, as it turns out, our solidarity movements, our global solidarity movements around the world increasingly are pushing back on corporatized, centralized tech use or the use of tech to help authoritarian governments and to push, these agendas. So yeah, I got deeply involved in that. And so it just evolved, right? It evolved from me being a systems administrator to developing websites, to working on the programmatic side of nonprofit organizations that are trying to leverage tech for women's rights and decolonization, and have worked as well on advocacy in the United States, because the U.S. plays like a really particular role in global everything, but in particular tech. And today, I guess just zooming forward a bunch of years, I spend a lot of time in global standards bodies where I feel that the impact of changing the way that low-layer protocols work in service of human rights can be really impactful. And just trying to narrow, because that's a huge field, specifically working on decentralized social media, encrypted messaging, and things like cybersecurity as it relates to child safety, or more broadly, the security of social movements and activists and journalists. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's as brief as I can be when I talk about my work.
Would you say that kind of explains what it means to be a public interest technologist? Or is there more that you think is useful to know, especially to developers who are building software?
I think it's a really wide term that can encompass so many different modes. I think I'm just one example, and I've just had I feel like I've had to both broaden and narrow my focus at different points, just depending on the state of the world. But no, I mean, I think I've seen folks who would consider themselves public interest technologists because they're building, they're building software, they're creating new apps or new services for activist journalists, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's just so many different ways to be public interest technologist. Academics often are doing a lot of research that maybe doesn't necessarily produce anything, but really produces a lot of knowledge that we need to understand the world, to understand the technical world that we're living in. So yeah, I just feel like it's one of those terms that you can apply to yourself if it feels like it fits. If you feel like the work you're doing is in the public interest, then that's what you are. So yeah, it's like being a radical. We used to say the term we used before this was radical techie, right? Somebody with radical politics who knows a thing or two about tech. So the terms evolve.
I love that. So as a dev, we build and deploy the internet to the internet. We might not always consider the governance behind it. Kind of coming into the public interest technologist, evolving that, can you explain the concept of internet governance to those who may be unfamiliar?
Yeah, this is something I love to talk about to audiences of all kinds. I can riff about this with my next door neighbor for an endless amount of time. But, I think this idea of the internet being so decentralized and so distributed that there's really no one place you can go to file a complaint or, make a change to a protocol. It's just so distributed, physically, right? And then in terms of the companies and the organizations that steward it. But it's also really distributed in terms of how it is, how the technology evolves, right? So, there is really one thing that is true across the entire internet, and that is the one protocol called Internet Protocol. It's, got a pretty memorable name, right? And if you are speaking Internet Protocol, you're effectively on the internet, right? But other than, the Internet Engineering Task Force is the standards body that standardized for the first time the Internet Protocol. This is decades ago, right? There's so much else beyond the IETF, although that's an example of a standards body that I go to regularly. They meet 3 times a year. They're still standardizing all kinds of things at all layers of the internet for the most part. But then there's all these other mechanisms that are also kind of like bottlenecks, like the, maybe bottleneck sounds a little pejorative, but you can also think of them as like fronts of struggle for, the equities involved in how the internet works. One is the domain name system, just the simple transference of a name to a number. The website wikipedia.org to the IP address where that website is hosted. That's a system. It's a technical layer that's also then buttressed by a whole lot of governance. So how do those names get distributed? How do the numbers get distributed? How do all those equities play out as different kinds of changes are made to the domain name system? So I'm kind of giving a couple different examples of how internet governance works in practice. But then I think there's this really big world out there of internet governance starting from like 2003 to 2005, when the United Nations started getting involved in the internet. It took them a while. Like if you're tracking from when internet started to when the UN started getting involved, like that's kind of a big gap, right? So they finally started thinking like, let's do something at a high level to really address or coordinate around the dissemination, the extension of global networking. And that's when the term internet governance really took off, is this idea that it's very much a distributed governance system, just like the internet is itself a distributed system. No one entity, not even the United Nations themselves, really control it. But it's more like, what can you do as your institution in your particular role in making this global communication system work? What can you contribute to that? And not like everybody, who gets to control it, right? Like there's no more really, wars or fights over, who gets to control what. It's more like, how do we pitch in? How do we make this better? But there have been fights over the years, right? Like the International Telecommunication Union is one of the oldest UN bodies. It's probably the oldest standards organization as well. And they wanted to do like the naming and numbering that now the DNS, which I mentioned before, is done by an institution called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. ITU really wanted to do that, right? They felt like they had telephony, they had telephone numbers, they organized the telephone system. Why not do the internet as well? So there was like this sort of historical fight around how the technology would be spec'd out. Would states be the ones to control it? Because the important things to know about the ITU is it's states only, which is what the UN system provides. But ICANN isn't. ICANN is not states only, but it does include states. It includes also other organizations and other institutions and nonprofits and businesses. And anyway, that's what we would call, ICANN is an example of like multi-stakeholder internet governance because of all these different groups that get deeply embedded in it, whereas the UN is a little bit more like a multilateral institution. So there are different flavors of internet governance, but I'm going to stop there because, as you can tell, like I'm really getting ramped up and going on and on about it. But it's just such a wide and multimodal way to engage in trying to figure out how to make decisions on behalf of human rights or the public interest in changes to the technology, but also the governance of how internet and web actually work.
Yeah, it's a pretty varied topology of different organizations and people. Have you seen these standard bodies like IETF and W3C, but also governments, private companies, as you're talking about, and other kind of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, all have some role in how the internet works and connects to various parts of it. Is that functioning in some kind of cooperation, or is there some balance that's tilted somewhere? Or is there a lot of tension within these organizations? How does that kind of play out over time?
Yeah, this is why I think it's so interesting to me, is that it is kind of like a dramedy throughout, the world. It varies, right? Like you can go really deep in one institution and kind of look at it and see its dynamics and understand where the imbalances are. I think it's hard to make generalizations, though. I will say, like, some of the trends that have struck me over the years are, let's look at the UN system, for example, right? Like it's very difficult at the Security Council for Russia, China, the US to agree on anything, right? They can't get anything done because they're all enemies, or, they're really in opposition to each other most of the time. Those same countries in a standards setting like the ITU or the IETF, or ICANN, right? They cooperate. They manage to work together. They standardize technologies. The major companies in China like Huawei, and then the major companies in the US and Canada like Cisco. I mean, they're all working together. The engineers know each other. They write specifications. They implement reference implementations. They work on the spec. They get it out there. They build products, which is really pretty staggering, right? So when the political system at the highest layers tends to fail, the sort of technical cooperation stays intact. There are certainly places where this does not work out, right? Like the internet infrastructure in like Palestine and Gaza, for example. For years, the ITU has said things that support Palestinian internet and like connectivity in places in war zones. But at the same time, like there's no way for them to politically recognize Palestine or do really anything about it other than to maybe put some funding towards building the networks. So as in, like, I think that what I'm trying to illustrate in these two very vast examples is like technology or technocracy alone is not enough in a lot of real material ways, but it is something that I think still brings people together when they're just trying to solve problems and they're trying to solve, interesting puzzles. That there's a lot more cooperation than I think we realize, but that can cut both ways, right? We're too comfortable sometimes in this like purely technology-driven assignment, and we are not as good at bringing that politically forward. But that's not to say there aren't politics and standards. There certainly are. There's definitely actors who, when you asked about the power dynamic, I think the biggest imbalance, right, is that it is companies dominated. Even in like the ITU, where it is states only that can be members, the delegations that the individual countries put together typically involve the people from the companies of that country, right? So like France's delegation is going to have a bunch of people from Orange Teleco, or like, just giving you an idea. So by and large, like everywhere you look in internet governance, at least if it's a sort of technical mode, is going to be stacked with private companies. And so I feel like one of the important things about getting involved in these highly technical and sort of arcane spaces as a public interest technologist is trying to offset that balance a little bit with, representing nonprofits, representing human rights, because, our voices are not as present. And I think that if we could tip that balance a little bit more, I think the world would be a little bit of a different place.
I don't envy anyone who has to go and sit through standards meetings at all.
They're a little slow. I will say that. Yeah.
So fascinating. I think this isn't spoken about enough, especially for developers and other people developing on the web. A big theme of this season has been centralization. So how did we get from the open protocol-based internet to a web where so much of our communication happens inside centralized platforms?
I think there's a story. The part of the story does happen in standards bodies. I do think that these are places where, there's an obvious risk of anti-competitive behavior. So, arcane spaces, you do have to sort of pay to play in some of them. They're all different in terms of their membership structure and participation or what have you. But, to be in a room with your competitors to talk about how you're going to do things together sounds a lot like antitrust behavior to me, right? Or it sounds, so I think that they're very conscious of this on a legal level, right? They have to keep their minutes open. There have to be modes of participation that don't lock out competitors. So there is some transparency mechanisms that are built in. And those same mechanisms are kind of what helps people like me participate, right? Like they're a little bit more open. It's a bit frustrating, like the ITU operates like the UN and keeps a lot of their documents behind, they're inaccessible unless you're a state or unless you're a part of the ITU formally. So that's a real barrier in that particular group. So even with best intentions, even with all the sort of legal infrastructure there to make sure that these companies are not colluding and price fixing and all of that, these things do tend to happen. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the issue is cooperation between the different companies, but it does mean that companies who become more powerful, they have bigger infrastructures, they impact more people, tend to be listened to a lot more. So, if you arrive at the IETF or the W3C, we haven't talked enough about the W3C, so let's do that. The W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, is a membership organization. You apply to be members, you pay an annual fee. If you just show up as a new person and you have a specification and you want to put that forward as a document and get a lot of people to work on it, it's unlikely that folks will have the time or the interest in listening to you if you don't have a really large user base, if you don't already have kind of a reference implementation that's interoperable with another reference implementation and so on. So that's kind of like a baseline expectation. But then it gets sort of worse, right? Like coupled with the fact that, if you are Google, you have a network like nobody else's network. You're on another planet from everybody else who's running networks, right? So you can spot things, you can fill gaps that are new and novel that other people wouldn't have been able to spot or fill. You also are kind of like taking, I've said this, in all seriousness, I think you're sometimes also taking an easier road, right? Like you're so vertically integrated, you don't have a lot of really hard problems like the rest of us do with like only a few layers, or whatever. So, they sometimes standardize things that benefit them architecturally because of where they sit. And also the things that they're standardizing or the things that they're reviewing that other people are trying to standardize come from a place of power, right? They have a lot of clout. They also have a lot of data, perspectives, trust, et cetera. So these things over time are not necessarily nefarious or malicious, but they just amount to having a ton of influence in these bodies. And I do think that influence sometimes then translates into some political weight in different organizations. So it can mean that it's easier to kill or slow down work that your competitors are doing in a nuanced way that doesn't look like it's an attack. But, these things absolutely do happen. And in the case where, standardization is so important for interoperability when you need like one protocol instead of two or N protocols, it does feel sometimes like picking a winner is what happens maybe on like a fine-grained layer. Like, so only people who are really paying close attention to some of the changes will even notice that a winner is being picked. But yeah, I think the story of centralization of the internet really comes from a lot of that tendency. And yeah, standards bodies definitely play a role for sure. I also think that standards bodies, just one last element, maybe there are more, but the last one I can think of is that there's a lot, those are the places where a lot of deals maybe get done or relationships get built. Like I really, as an advocate, I really enjoy being able to go to standards bodies and talk to an engineer who can probably fix the problem much, much faster than anyone else in the company, right? It's just like a way faster way to advocate for what you need. And that's also true between companies. Like they can talk together, they can build relationships, they can get things fixed for each other, and they can also then go off and do other kinds of collaborations, go off and make other kinds of deals, go off and vertically integrate in new and novel ways, right? So that is also another way that centralization can be facilitated by standards bodies.
How does this kind of outsized influence that some of these companies have at these standards bodies and shaping the way these things are formalized, how does that translate down to services that we might be building on top of, whether that's email deliverability with the system that we're building? Maybe we're not using Google or Microsoft for email, and we're using something else. Does it impact that? Does it tend to favor one service over another, or does it keep the playing field pretty even?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the goal is to try to keep it even. I do think the explicit aim is to just come up with the best possible solution for all use cases. What are the requirements? What are the constraints? Let's think of this from an ideal perspective. At the end of the day, though, I really do think that these, what I've described in the previous response, coupled with the governance layer, is what I think winds up making it not so. So here, like an example of what I mean, and we haven't talked about the standards body, and I'm excited to talk about it, which is, it's got the weirdest acronym of all time. It's called the Messaging, Malware, and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group. And the acronym is M3AAWG. And it's pronounced MOG, which is not so bad. So getting from one to the other is important. Anyway, so MOG is a place, they also meet an extraordinarily three times a year. That's extraordinarily often. It is about email and spam effectively, right? They are trying to solve the issue of spam. The email protocols are not enough. Even mobile telephony, like those protocols do nothing to deal with the issue of spam. It's such a pervasive problem that they have this group that meets multiple times a year to come up with documents and specifications. Now, I think they make a good case for why they are completely, they're nothing is public. Everything is private. You have to be a member to get access to any of the documents or any of the meetings. And it's because, if you're doing anti-malware specifications and you're somebody who deals in malware, boy, wouldn't it be nice to know what kinds of mechanisms they're coming up with. It's a bit of a flimsy argument from a holistic cybersecurity perspective, but nonetheless, we leave that aside. But what's happened over time is that, effectively, people don't really want to use email services that are not part of the big few, right? That because the spam problem is so pervasive, because they're choosing to use something like Google or Microsoft or Apple. Apple is a distant third, by the way. That, that tends to centralize over time. And then I think what happens is they're, in an effort to try to create protocol level signals that improve this for everyone. You don't just have to be part of this small group. You can go to the IETF, and the IETF is still innovating and extending email and DNS and all of that to combat spam. You have to then implement those protocols. So if you're a small email provider, you are effectively at a disadvantage on all these levels, right? You will be actioned probably because somebody's account got hacked, and then you're gray listed or you're blocklisted, and getting back on is really tough. So you have all that to deal with. And then you have these protocol changes that are happening at this standards body you've never heard of. And you need to implement them now because Gmail or Outlook or all of them have said, if you don't implement this in 30 days, we're effectively not dealing with you anymore as an email sender and receiver. So you have to then change, your whole infrastructure to deal with like these new protocol signals. And so it can just feel like a lot. And I think those kinds of impacts, while yes, like they're meant to sort of evolve the space, they definitely disadvantage competitors. They definitely disadvantage people who are maybe running their own mail server because they do it for their friends and they're doing it effectively for free. And it's not necessarily a business. That can just really like basically kick them off of the network. So hopefully that's like an illustration of how some of this works, but it also can be the same for, I feel like podcasts went through a moment, right? Like podcasting is a surprisingly open system, and we can dive into, why that might be, but like there have been attempts over time to kind of try to capture podcasts, to try to capture that space. And it's been, an effort in trying to keep these things open so that, anyone sort of in that network of providing podcasts and hosting them doesn't get captured by like one winner who then tries to evolve the space in a way that, builds a moat and makes them more successful than the rest.
So what happens to the users when the competitors are kicked off? Maybe a single organization or maybe a few, Google, Microsoft, the big ones, take over the field. What do users lose when identity, audience, content, distribution they kind of become locked behind a platform and that platform takes over?
Well, I think a lot of us have direct experience with this sort of thing, right? A platform makes a decision that we don't like, and you can post about it to your friends, and that's kind of your only recourse. It feels so, and as you're posting it, as you're like typing out your rage, you can feel like the disempowerment happening because like you can't do anything about it. So that's one, right? Like we just lose agency because there's no choice. We can't go anywhere else. And so we really want to avoid that, right? Because that is like maybe the first issue, but then there's so many knock-on effects that happen afterwards, right? We then kind of get locked into where we feel almost like exploited, like we're having to imbibe advertising or other kinds of, content being fed to us that we really don't want. We want to opt out of, but we don't know how to do that. So yeah, I think it's like the first of many escalating harms. And we're also, I think that when we sort of get to content layer, and I think it sounds like, we're moving in that direction, like away from these sort of lower layer protocols that just send bits and bytes back and forth. We're talking about email, we're talking about our private communications, we're talking about our social networks and how we communicate with our friends and our customers or people who are interested in us on a daily basis. It really becomes just this idea of ownership. Like we want to be able to own our content or our personas or our networks, right? Like who follows us and who we follow. And that just becomes really difficult when the forces are exactly against us, right? That the thing that we value, which is all of our friends, are actually kind of part of the business model of the platform that we chose to build that network on. And in a way, sometimes companies will say this out loud. There have been a few instances in the media where it's almost like they slipped and said something they shouldn't have said, but it's like they consider that their property. They created that for you. You didn't create. This is not yours. This is something that we generated this value and it belongs to us. And so when they're in trouble in courts, or that's usually when it comes out, right? When in a court process, or they will say that it is something that you might have posted this 240 characters or something, but like everything else belongs to the company. That's, I think, a hard pill to swallow for a lot of us. And even if they didn't believe that, right? Like let's take email, for example. Like ostensibly nobody's arguing that all of your emails belong to the company, right? They're your emails, but it's really difficult to get them out, right? To get all your emails out and to put them then on a different server, like is a huge hurdle for a lot of people. And even if they're quote automated tools, right? There's all kinds of dragons in that process, right? Like you think it's fine. You're like, okay, I've got the tarball. I'm ready. Like it just
None
does
of the
not.
attachments or...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Or, oh God, some of it was encrypted with a key that I don't have anymore. There's just like so many things that it just is never, it's never going to be easy because these platforms, like while they absolutely could make migration tools and these tools to facilitate that, it is not in their best interest to do so. And so they have not got a whole team working on data portability, for example, because that's something for you. That's not something for them. That's not going to make their revenue increase at all, right? A lot of questions, in corporate spaces are, does your team make money? Well, none of those features would make that company any money. So they just don't get built. And that's, some would say, like the cynical view is that's what we would expect from, big companies. Like that's how they operate. But I think there's lots and lots and lots of folks, I'm sure they're in your audience, who make things for other reasons, right? And so obviously, if you're making things for other reasons, you want people to have a good experience, you want them to use your stuff, then you're prioritizing the user. But the problem is that, then those tools or technologies or those services that value things other than profits don't have the same interoperability. They don't have, that goes back to all those ways they're disadvantaged in standards bodies, internet governance, and so on. It's just like an uphill battle for them. So even though good ideas should prevail, that's just not always the case.
I think that's a great segue to talk about the Social Web Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about the Social Web Foundation and the problems that you all are trying to solve?
We are really focused on the open social web, like making social media a thing that is beyond the walled garden apps and services that we've all grown accustomed to, that we all kind of feel a bit trapped by. This is that, you could download, your social media tarball, right? And then actually take it somewhere, do something with it. And maybe you won't ever have to do that again. Like there's some notion of, if we can really open up this space from a true interoperable protocol position, you'll never have to make a new account again. Like, wouldn't that be so amazing? I'm overwhelmed with the number of logins that I have to different platforms. And but to make that kind of, it's a big bet to make a really big ecosystem shift like that. So the Social Web Foundation is trying to steward that larger project, right? There's a lot of different folks building some cool stuff, and we just want to make sure everybody's kind of talking to each other. We're all kind of on the same page about things. We all feel like we're on the same side, right? We're all working towards the same goals, but it just provides a little bit of that coordination. So yeah, I can talk a little bit about how we think of the bigger change, right? Years of nonprofits have me think in terms of the theory of change. But if we want a really big, successful, joyful, fun, exciting social web that is not a part of the traditional corporate webs, or not I guess like walled up in some of those, then we need to have a few different objectives. One is there's got to be a protocol, right? Or a set of protocols that can be extended and evolved over time. So that's like one thing we work on. Both Evan and I are protocol people. He works a lot more in the W3C than I do these days, and I stay in my lane in the IETF. Then we also work with the platform. So there's so many different platforms that are adopting this protocol called ActivityPub. You've also heard maybe of like AT-Proto for Blue Sky, and then DSNP for MeWe and a few other things. We're really focused on ActivityPub just because it seems like there are far more platforms using it right now, and it's got a lot more decentralized weight behind it. So the platforms that are implementing it, right? Like folks have heard of Mastodon. Folks have heard maybe of, Ghost or Automatic's WordPress that uses it. Anyway, there's more every day, and it's such a wonderful thing. So we try to work with the platforms then to help them either implement the evolved protocol that we talked about in the first strategy, or just kind of like interoperate together, know each other, get on the same page, meet each other at conferences, whatever it is. So we work with platforms secondly. And then thirdly, like we're trying to really answer the question of, what for, right? Like open web for what? And that I think is an important question to answer, especially if we want to work on human rights issues. We want to work with philanthropists to try to help them understand like how this is important for democracy, how this is important for, open information, et cetera. So the third piece is we really want to prioritize our time working with social movements, working with human rights organizations, journalists, activists, and so on. So that's sort of the third thing that we do. That when we are trying to answer that question of like, what are we building this for? Like for us, that's the answer. For others, it might be arts and other, education, wonderful, wonderful things. We want to work with them too, but our priority is with the human rights community. And then, we want to just create a strong institution for the long term. Like, so as any good, theory of change for a nonprofit, you got to think about the institution. So, folks may have heard of like the Web Foundation is a good example. We've talked about the W3C. There's a foundation that exists to preserve the web in the long term, and that's the Web Foundation. Internet Society plays a very similar role for internet. They've been around for a really long time and steward that larger space, internet for internet's sake. And so I think the Social Web Foundation tries to be that for the open social web. Just really trying to be a strong institution in the long term as this evolves.
Something I've heard a number of people kind of in the last few years in the Elixir space for sure, but elsewhere, like, what is this Fediverse thing? I don't understand. I wish someone could explain it to me in a way that it makes sense to me. And so, I'm hoping that you can provide us with an explanation of what the Fediverse is and kind of what the difference is between building one better platform versus an ecosystem of interoperable platforms.
Yeah. And I will say, every time I explain this, I do it slightly differently. So let's hope it's one of the good days where it actually, makes sense and lands. But, I think we've all had this experience, right? Maybe I'll start with the one I talked a little bit about my own personal feelings. It's like, I just don't want to open another account again. Like, I love TikTok. It's so great when people send me videos. It makes me happy. But I don't have an account because I just cannot. I'm not going to download another app on my phone. I love, when people share things with me, but, I'm also pleased if they just like take a screenshot of the meme and like they send that to me too, right? Having a Fediverse, having like this protocol, one or a few protocols underlie all of these different platforms would mean that I don't have to have a separate account to engage with this. Like, you can share it with me and then I can share it with somebody else and I can spread the love. It all these emails die with me, or like text messages like die with me because I don't have accounts on these platforms. And so I can't, like reshare or interact with it in any meaningful way. That would change, right? Like, so I could have, one account. Or maybe I have like an alter ego. So I have two accounts, right? But largely, right, all of the content that exists on any other kind of social web, I could interact with it. I could share it. I could like it. There's just like a lot of things we can do. I also want to just talk about this for a second, because the idea that I had MySpace. I was an early adopter. My campus was an early adopter of Facebook back when it was like just for U.S. colleges. This idea that we still can basically only do three things with any piece of content is like blows my mind. Like, it has been 25 years, everyone, where you can like something, you can share it again, or you can make a comment on it. And like, we have not evolved past that. It's like another example of like how these centralized platforms have disenfranchised us. Like, there should be so many more ways that you can interact with content beyond those few things. But change has been very, very slow. So I guess what I want is I think the folks who are excited about the open social web is that you have a lot more agency because you have a lot more builders. You have a lot more people trying to do cool stuff that helps present, create, consume content of all kinds within many different conceptions of what a network can be. You don't have to necessarily overthink this is my professional life versus my personal life. I mean, those things, of course, you can do, but they don't have to be like physically separate and different services. Another thing I really think would be great, we've already talked a little bit about, is like the portability question. Stuff happens, right? Like, companies go under. services expire, like something's no longer hip and cool anymore. And it sucks when it was like your thing and you invested a lot of time in it, right? Like it's hard to know what to do with all of that stuff that you put on a platform somewhere. You can download it and it basically just lives on your hard drive, right? It would be so nice if that portability that a common protocol could unlock means that you could take that and actually put it back up somewhere and have your content live on. Maybe without the same context, but could still, sort of approximate your contribution to the internet in some way. That's what I got. That was a long explanation, but I hope it helps understand, what's at stake. I think it's not just like, okay, download a new thing and log in. It's better than the rest. And then you do it. And you're like, wow, this is not cool as shiny. And none of my friends are here. Because I think that's sometimes what happens with the Fediverse for people. But instead, we're doing this slowly to build up, something that is much, much bigger. So I guess what I described, that sort of sad experience, is what we kind of tend to expect when a new winner comes up or when there's a new rockstar app, right? We expect to be excited like we did when there was TikTok, right? And that's just not what happens, because I think right now we're trying to, build the infrastructure that would allow something much bigger to emerge.
I think that's a great explanation. Yeah, that was a good one. I read that your mission statement says that the Fediverse should be, quote, growing, healthy, sustainable, and multipolar. I just wanted to talk about that word, multipolar. It's doing a lot of work there. Why that specifically, and why isn't decentralized enough?
Right. That's a good thing to dive into. I think it's because there's just a recognition that things are popular and that popularity can drive more popularity, right? It tends to be that we as social networks huddle around certain kinds of things. So I think the notion of multipolar is we recognize there are going to be big services, and that's not a bad thing if they can interoperate with each other. And if they allow for things like, user agency to move around, it's not trying to, claim that your content is their content, that sort of thing. So what I think folks were worried about in the beginning was that, like some other open source protocols and things, that if you do get one big player who's an early adopter, that they can kind of eat the world a little bit, right? That they can kind of take over and then they dictate how that evolves. Folks in the Fediverse space are hyper vigilant against things like that. And so instead of saying we don't like big players, I think what we were trying to say with the multipolar idea is that we need multiple players, and we want all of them to be successful, and we want them. I think the idea of choice amongst many means that there's a balance rather than sort of this resistance to something that almost feels like entropy, right? Like somebody's going to emerge. It would be bad if it were one. So let's think about structuring this emergence so that many people win and that they are countervailing forces.
I think that's great. I like that. So along the same line of federation, could you describe for our audience, high level, what ActivityPub is, the protocol, and how it fits into all of this?
Yeah, so there are two things to know about ActivityPub. Is from a protocol layer, it's really two things. One is it's a data structure that's called activity streams, and it just treats pieces of content with an extensible framework. So there are some obvious ones, right? Like if I'm a person versus an account, right? Versus a post. So I have a post, the post is an object, I am a user, right? And so it's all kind of structuring all the data that's associated with that, right? If I am a person, then I have a bio and I have a link that may, verify that I am associated with that link. And I follow people and they follow me, and et cetera, et cetera. And with a post, it has different features like it's got a URL and it has a title, maybe. It might have content. It might have been liked by someone else. It might have been reshared by someone else. Like, it has all these different features associated with it. Activity streams is a standard that codifies that. It can be extended. You can add all kinds of stuff to it if you want. You don't have to stick to what other people are using. Then there's Activity Pub, and that is the part that standardizes how this content gets sent around and how users can interact with that content and how users can interact with each other. And this is the part where it sort of standardizes, like, okay, if I like something, then my server is contacting the server of the content to record that that like happened and that we have, basically a mirrored image of that interaction. So it's more the protocol of like the activity, which is where Activity Pub comes from, right? So I think that it fits in because it is really similar in design to the web, to this. It's not necessarily like, HTML and CSS for a website, right? Which kind of is a way of structuring that information. It's definitely using those protocols. It's building with things that already exist. But you can imagine, for example, activity streams being a really great way to encapsulate other kinds of content off of social media. So like you could use activity streams to use as your instant messaging content structure, right? Instead of like XML, right? You could use activity streams, and then you could maybe think about fitting messaging into social media. So direct messages is an example of that. Like, we've all kind of come to expect that the social media applications that we're on, the platforms that we're on, they also have a messaging feature. This also exists in the social web, right? Like Mastodon and a few others have this idea of direct, not all of them, but some of them do this notion of direct messaging. And in the sort of most basic way, they just treat the audience for a post that is a direct message between two people. So the audience is not public. It's just like you and me, which is not exactly from a, cybersecurity and encryption perspective, like I think an actual confidential conversation. So, Activity Pub has been able to be integrated with something called messaging layer security, which is another protocol, right, where we can treat those messages separately. So I'm just giving an example of like how you can literally fit, different protocols together. So the activity streams content is enciphered. It uses the Activity Pub protocol to send it between people on an Activity Pub server conversation, and then it can be decrypted on either side. So like that's a way that it can just fit in with other things. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful. I feel, like I'm sure there's a lot of different developers that listen to your podcast that are thinking about like, okay, how does content turn into an activity streams object, and how does the Activity Pub server send it back and forth? So just trying to give some imagination there.
No, I love that. While doing research for this podcast, this episode today, I learned that Threads, Meta's product, federates via Activity Pub. So it's the single biggest instance in the Fediverse by user count, and it's owned by Meta. Is that a win for openness, or is it a kind of embrace, extend, extinguish risk? What do you think?
Yes. I mean, you're bringing up something that was worrying in the beginning, and kind of why we have this piece about multipolar in our mission statement, and why the Social Web Foundation was so critical in that time to exist, because folks were really worried about that happening, that EEE, right? So I think my personal feeling, right, is that if this is an open protocol, we really cannot worry so much about how it gets used. I think what we need to worry about is the way that it gets extended and adopted more broadly. So, things that have gone poorly in the past, been like RSS, right? Which was also, I think, maybe Google had something to do with that not going, not becoming as popular, staying as popular as it once was. It's important, I think, to focus on this governance aspect, to focus on like a stewardship that exists beyond one company, one player. So that's sort of what the Social Web Foundation is trying to provide. At the same time, like the other thing that we've talked about with respect to Meta is you don't have to federate with threads. Like you can, as an instance operator, say, like, we will not federate with this particular service or server. That's a choice that can be made. The Fediverse, because it's an open ecosystem, because it's an open, protocol, it's also very much it's an enthusiastic yes protocol, right? Like you have to follow someone to get their content. You have to interoperate with someone to be able for the users on either side to be able to talk to each other. And if you don't want to, you don't have to, right? Like if I don't want to see anyone from Threads, if I don't want anyone from Threads to see me, like there are settings for that because again, like you have to sort of opt in. So that's, I think, what buttresses is a little bit. But not to say that there is no risk. I think there's an absolute risk. I think we want another big player to sort of come and balance it out. I mean, ideally, like all of them, right? Like one mode is that decentralized social media becomes successful because all of the existing social media companies adopt it. Like that is one view of a successful future. And as long as you still get, credible exit, portability, like all the things that we've been talking about that to be important, then we still win, right? So I hope like we get more people joining the Fediverse at that size, not fewer. And with the sort of infrastructures we have in place, the networks we have in place to talk amongst protocol developers and platforms, I feel confident that we can support those kinds of big players in the sense that we will not let them capture this space.
If you can't see content from someone if you haven't followed them, how do you discover people you don't already know? How do you discover information that's not in your bubble in a situation like this?
Yeah, the discoverability problem is a real one for sure. It's, if I could to make a comparison just to the web, is also had this problem, right? It was not obvious how to find things at first. And it was actually something like the web in particular was not really popular right out the gate, right? Because of this problem, because you didn't even know what you didn't know. You didn't know what was out there until the Mosaic browser and like then eventually, Tim Berners-Lee and then other people started to figure out this problem of like, okay, you need to like index things. You need to like, here's a website of websites. Go to the website of websites and find some cool stuff. WebRing. Yes. And, Google search. We do come back around to these ideas of like, wow. And now, there's a strong case to be made that Google search should just be like a public good because it effectively does something nobody else can do. So, we need to find solutions that are cross-cutting. We need to think of this as not like different apps. Not only that different apps can build on this, but like also intermediary cross-cutting functions can be built. Another one that I think is a really hard problem is trust and safety, right? If you're a small platform provider, the idea that you now need to like spin up not just like spam filters, but like all kinds of other kinds of, vigilance around certain content and so on is like a really heavy lift if you're a small provider. It would be a lot more helpful if we had tools and intermediary services that can help with that and things like that. So I think discoverability is just one of these hard problems we need to think about from an ecosystem level. And, again, something that I think Social Web Foundation or others kind of in this intermediary space like can start really thinking about and building. So we've tried. So tags.pub is a project you can look up. We talk about it on our website. We're trying to think about the discoverability problem through hashtags and making it so that hashtags can be a discoverability vector across instances rather than per instance. Like I can use hashtags on like my instance, but that's obviously not the idea. We want to use it across all instances. So, small problems hopefully lead to bigger solutions is how we're starting out.
We have so many more questions we want to ask, but we are coming up on time, unfortunately. But we'll try and get a couple more in here. There's a couple of topics that I want to hit on briefly, if we can, before we do wrap. One is about how the design of things affects society, but also getting a little bit into AI, getting onto social web and
Yeah.
bots on the on ActivityPub and kind of does that magnify it? So let's start with is there a relationship between the development of new technologies or the underpinning infrastructure and existing inequalities in our societies?
I would say enthusiastically, yes, unfortunately. But this is one of the reasons why we have engaged in standards bodies for so long, is just this idea that low level decisions can have big impacts, particularly on things like privacy, free expression. But other stuff is wrapped up in that as well, and those rights are enabling rights, and so on. So yes, I think that we've talked a lot about how just even open architecture can make such a difference for users' everyday experiences of the tools that they use, and it creates an environment in which folks can try to solve problems, or folks can mitigate problems others created, right? And it's not just left up to spending so much time. Having worked in human rights organizations during these crucial digital age years, right? I have so many colleagues, myself included, who have just spent so much public money, so much time like begging Facebook or Google to like fix something. And they do maybe eventually. And then it just takes one CEO level decision to undo all of it, right? I just feel like we're trying to create something bigger. We're trying to create something more hard, like more durable, so that, yeah, we don't have to start from scratch every time a CEO buys something and then makes, like, yeah, this will endure, I think, beyond that. And that is good for human rights in the long term.
So then kind of extending from that, briefly, a lot of your recent work at the Social Web Foundation has been about AI and the social web colliding. Agentic AI is starting to interact on these open protocols. What are the governance questions you're worried about that aren't getting enough attention?
Right. I think that there's been a lot of attention to the bot conversation, like bot crawlers. Maybe not in every community, but from my vantage point, folks have talked a lot about how they don't want scrapers taking their data and throwing it in an LLM somewhere. I think that's a totally valid concern, right? Like that's just how we got here, right? How we got to this place where there's just so much intellectual theft went into building, the biggest tech sector, et cetera, right? So that's a concern. I think less is maybe appreciated when it comes to like the how people will use it going forward. So like not so much bot crawling for the purposes of building an LLM, but like what happens when people are talking to an AI agent, that agent is doing something for them, and that might need um, the 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 AI agent to go out and find an answer or look for something. And let's say, you're a journalist and you've built like your whole publication, or you're, even some publications are on the Fediverse, right? They've built all their information on these platforms, and that those agents need to be able to ground their answers in reality, right? They're stuck in whenever they were made, 2012 or something. They need to know what's happening today. That bot is going to crawl your site and it's going to try to get the right answer. I don't know that we should necessarily be blocking all of that, right? I don't know that we should necessarily be walling off that kind of content. So it's something to think about. I think it's a gray area, right? I think it's something that we're not really interrogating very much. There's just sort of like a knee-jerk reaction, like, all bots are bad bots because they're building LLMs. And I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I also just worry about like the mental model folks have around, what these agents could do. So yeah, there's a lot of I guess there's a lot of business models being pitched out there. And so certainly folks imagine that like you could, I don't know, like build new AI tools for social media use, like algorithms. Like mostly before the AI, we were just talking about like the algorithms for your timelines, right? We've changed our language around that a little bit, but like, algorithmic feeds is something also people really don't like because they feel like it's manipulated to sell them stuff. But that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. You can also create algorithmic feeds for other things that are maybe pro-social or that are about like leveling the playing field in terms of voice and representation and diversity. Like there's a lot of different ways I think we can think about algorithmic feeds or curatorial social web stuff that doesn't have to be, they could have different values driving it and they could have different outcomes for people. So I kind of am interested in exploring that. And it doesn't, I think, all have to be negative. I mean, it certainly could be, but if we do cool stuff that isn't negative, maybe that can be prevailing for once.
I guess to kind of close here, I'm curious. This is two-part. When developers are building things for the public, what are the kinds of things that are worth thinking about? And maybe a short list, only because we're short on time. And what gives you hope about the open internet right now?
Right. I think folks need to really think through privacy implications. I've spent so many years trying to undo privacy coming in very late in the game. So whatever you're building, make sure you are thinking about the closed confidential version of the thing that you're building. I think that people should also really, think about what users would find useful, right? It's not just what's easy to build or what benefits the service side of things. Sometimes you have to make a hard trade-off to make this more usable for end users. Usability is always huge, right? Like, do a lot of testing. People will surprise you and what their expectations are. And you just cannot short shrift it or just chalk it up to people not being power users or whatever. Like you just have to accept that, there's a lot of different people out there. And if you want them to use your stuff, you should ask them how they're going to use it. But yeah, I'm super hopeful. My gosh, I think this is the most exciting time to be building stuff. I know that there's a lot of fear out there, but just talking about AI or whatever, it's democratized, right? Like if we think that, this technology that certainly existed before ChatGPT released it, if the thing that worries us is that like everybody can use it now, like that's something that authoritarians like to say, right? Like I like to think of this idea of we've democratized a really powerful tool and we should be excited to embrace it in all kinds of new ways that big corporates and governments haven't yet thought of, because that's what I'm excited about.
It's an exciting time. Yeah. Well, I think we are going to wrap. Thank you so much, Mallory, for being able to talk to us. This is such an important topic, especially given all of the activity nowadays. And are there any final plugs, anything else that the listeners should know that you're working on, anything about where they can find you and the work that you're doing?
I'm excited about the, end-to-end encrypted DMs in the social web. So that's going to be work that is released soon. One of our first reference implementations uses Elixir, so I know that there's overlap there. So I hope that folks will follow that work, and you can always find us on the web or the social web, socialwebfoundation.org. And I'm just really grateful that you thought my work would have overlap with your audience. I'm so excited to be invited to talk to you all about this stuff. And here's to more conversations.
Cheers. Well, that has been Mallory Knodel. And for our Elixir community out there, if you are interested in the Fediverse, you can go in and explore. Pleroma, Acoma, Bonfire are all projects in the Fediverse that are in Elixir. So go and explore. Awesome. Thank you so much, Mallory.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Take care, guys. Nice to see you.
Elixir Wizards is a production of Smart Logic. You can find us online at smartlogic.io.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. This episode was produced and edited by Paloma Pachenik for Smart Logic.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week for another episode of The State of the Stack.
Hey, this is Yair Flicker, president of Smart Logic, the company that brings you this podcast. Smart Logic is a consulting company that helps our clients accelerate the pace of their product development. We build custom software applications for our clients, typically using Phoenix and Elixir, Rails, React, and Flutter for mobile app development. We're always happy to get acquainted, even if there isn't an immediate need or opportunity. And, of course, referrals are always greatly appreciated. Please email contact@smartlogic.io to chat. Thanks, and have a great day.